So I just read Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. This is obviously a classic. I've never read it before though, and unlike some classics, this one was not boring at all. I absolutely loved it. Of course, I didn't love everything about it, but overall, I loved it. I also feel like I should mention this book was written over 200 years ago. I mean, it was published originally in 1818, and this is the 1818 text, because there were some changes made to 1831 text, which I don't know, I can't speak about because I didn't really look into it in detail, but I wanted the original text. Okay, so 200 years ago, it was written around the same time as Jane Austen, but I found this book much easier to read than Jane Austen, whose sentences I find rather difficult to follow at times, and I feel like I can't really read her books without having watched the movie adaptation first, whereas this one I definitely could. It was also interesting, sort of the style in which it was written, or the format, I suppose, because first it starts from the perspective of an adventurous seafaring captain traveling towards the North Pole. And given what I knew about Frankenstein, I didn't know what this guy was doing in the narrative. So it was a tad bit frustrating until we did meet Dr. Frankenstein, just because I can be a bit impatient. But by the end of the book, I do understand his role in this story. Anyway, so first we are introduced to the captain, then he meets Dr. Frankenstein, who tells him his story, and within Dr. Frankenstein's story, we also hear story told from the perspective of the being that he creates, sometimes called the monster. But I prefer, and the author who wrote the introduction, the modern introduction to this edition, he also is of the opinion that this being should be called the being instead of the monster or the creature, because the being gives this unnamed being a sense of morality, a sense of personhood, instead of creature, which has negative connotations or dehumanizing connotations, or the monster, which obviously is very negative. So anyway, what was I talking about? Yeah, so then we hear the story from the being's perspective, and in that way, it is a story within a story within a story, which can lead us to question the veracity of this tale, but in the end, I don't know that that even matters because of the moral lessons that remain. So the plot was absolutely brilliant, if you ask me. I love the erratic relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and the being, whom I sometimes affectionately call Frankie, but for clarity, I'll just call him the being. And I also love the parallels that are drawn between these two characters. For example, the being is often called a wretch, and sometimes Dr. Frankenstein will refer to himself as a poor wretch. And so in that very obvious reuse of this word, I see a parallel, but also in other things that I won't get into, not to spoil. Yeah, this novel was tragic. I don't know that it is truly horrifying, but of course modern sensibilities are different, or maybe I'm just a freak for horror. I don't know. But it was tragic and it was emotional. It really stirred up my moral feelings. And even if you read the synopsis or some kind of introduction to the book, but especially if you didn't, there are surprises and twists in the book, which I didn't expect. I mean, this book was really so much better than I expected, probably because of the moral content, because I am an ethicist, so I go nuts for that kind of stuff. And I also study psychology. So truly the being, my favorite character, amazing depth in that character. I believe there was some magical realism. Correct me if it doesn't count as magical realism, but I think that when Dr. Frankenstein falls terribly ill every time that he is overwhelmed by his stress and emotions regarding the being that he has created, I think that is an instance of magical realism, and I had never seen that before in a book that was originally written in English, so that was pretty cool to see. The pacing was a bit strange to me. It seemed to kind of stretch go long on environmental descriptions. It's like describing the mountains and the weather and the river and things like that, which I suppose might be part of this genre and this time period, this Gothic romance. And when I say romance, I mean not what we call romance, but what they called romance. And then it also went very quickly through exciting and what I would have expected to be action-packed scenes, or even just scenes such as when Dr. Frankenstein was in the laboratory and when he was collecting materials. They just kind of said he collected materials, and I would love to know, where did they come from? And how was it collecting the materials? Because we can imagine gruesome, dark things like digging in a cemetery or stealing bodies from the gallows, things like that. Maybe it is mentioned, I can't remember precisely, but if it is, it's just a sentence. And I would have loved more description on that. That would have brought the horror out and would have been more exciting for me. But this pacing thing could just be, probably is just a style related to the time period in which it was written. Getting onto the characters, the women in the book were pretty, really uninteresting characters, as they tend to be in old books, but I did find that surprising since this was written by a woman, Mary Shelley. It was a bit surprising that the female characters were still very uninteresting, but perhaps at the time only men could have adventurous tales, or perhaps she did this somehow on purpose to focus on the folly of men. I don't know. There is a portion in the introduction of my edition that discusses gender, but I won't get more into that. And Dr. Frankenstein and his contemporaries, his friends, his family, they could get a bit annoying, of course, because of my modern sensibilities. What they had issues with, what they thought was important was a bit, but still it was interesting to see his perspective on things, especially as it compared to the being. And now we get to my absolute favorite character of the book, probably everyone's favorite character. Poor guy, the being. He was called a wretch and a fiend and a monster and a creature, all very deplorable names, all very judgmental. And it's so sad because he was initially judged because of his looks. I mean, because he looked scary and ugly and large. And so he was treated very poorly. He was never even given a name. That's why you have to call him something like the being or the creature, though I prefer the being, as I mentioned. I really did feel a lot of empathy towards the being and really was super impressed by his mental acuity, how quickly he learned things, much quicker than a newborn baby. And he even picked up language in just a couple of years. And I mean, language, not just basic language like you might see in the movie adaptations, but very complex, eloquent language that rivaled that of Dr. Frankenstein. And he did this not by learning directly, but by observing people who were talking. So that's also very impressive. I cannot do that myself. But most impressive and most interesting to me personally was his grasp of morality and of justice. And so as an ethicist myself, his monologues and his arguments were my favorite passages of the book. Absolutely loved it. And it's interesting how he would briefly convince some others to see his point of view, but then very quickly they would change their mind again and say, no, you're a wretch, you're a horrible creature, and not deserving of any of my empathy or anything. Poor guy. Excluded from all society, rejected, and gosh, I mean, he starts out as such a sweet little helper. Basically, the message of the book is that you should treat others well. This is totally simplifying it, but that you should treat others well, or else they're perhaps justified in having more evil predilections. Let's see, I think there was a portion in the book. Yeah, there is something in the appendix that was written by Percy Shelley, Mary's husband, that kind of explains the message of the book. Treat a person ill and he will become wicked. Divide him, a social being, from society, and you impose upon him the irresistible obligations, malevolence, and selfishness. And then speaking specifically of the being, the circumstances of his existence are so monstrous and uncommon that when the consequences of them become developed in action, his original goodness was gradually turned into inextinguishable misanthropy and revenge. So that's basically what the book is about. And it's really a shame that the film adaptations don't quite cover that. So yeah, overall, absolutely adored this book. It was a bit slower to progress through, but that I think is just because of the antiquated language. It just takes me longer to process and to read. That being said, it was not as difficult a book to read as other books that were written at the time period. My book did have notes in the end, but very often the notes were clarifying where they were, because apparently that was very important, what mountain range they were on. I personally don't care, but yeah, can't say if the notes didn't help me. The introduction probably helped me. Anyway, the being, despite some of the despicable, truly despicable acts that he does, I still adored him and empathized with him. And I really love the moral complexity that his character presented in the book. I mean, truly, have I not mentioned it enough? Best character in the book. And I'm sure that was Mary Shelley's intent. And yeah, especially given how crazy different the film adaptations and other types of adaptations of Frankenstein are, I'm really glad that I finally read this book and got to know the real story of Frankenstein and his being.